Okay, hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and I'm glad to be here today. It's been a bit crazy this week, but we are back to streaming on a regular schedule, and everything's good up until 4th of July week, which we will be out that week, and hopefully we'll have a bunch of YouTube content for you for that time. So that'll be good stuff, and I'm really hoping that Fall of Argenport doesn't launch when that happens. But nonetheless, Fall of Argenport is going to launch, and it's going to launch probably pretty soon. We might see it at the end of this month, we might see it at the beginning of next one, or like even a little bit later if I'm super lucky and nobody else is. Yeah, so there's a bunch of new cards that have been spoiled. There were a couple spoiled this weekend, and we are now starting to get into some official mechanics breakdowns. So we've been talking about a bunch of different stuff. There is the new Berserk mechanic, there is some other cool stuff that we've actually been doing, like things we've talked about the merchants a little bit, so we're starting to go through the mechanics of them, and I believe the next article is going to be on tribute, and we should see some more tribute cards, which will be really cool. But today we're going to be talking about Berserk, and we're going to be showing off the cards from this weekend, which I missed because I was not in town. So we're going to go ahead and talk over all of those and see what all we've got to start with. First off is Burglarize, a 4-cost Nightfall card, and it's always good to see more Nightfall cards. I'm very glad that there are more of that mechanic, because just having extra Nightfall cards gives us a lot of extra options to play with as far as basically making Nightfall decks happen for real. Like there are a couple of interesting things that you can do with Nightfall decks where it is basically eternally night, and if you can actually get that sort of thing going on, then it can be really cool. But the overall power level of Nightfall cards is not that strong, so it's kind of hard to get an all Nightfall deck going on, and it means that it's a little tricky to get that kind of thing working. Burglarize is a kind of fascinating card. So as a 4-cost for Double Shadow, it's the same cost and the same essential effect as Subvert, which is to say that it steals something of your opponent's and puts it into your hand. It does steal something from your opponent's play, which means that you get to develop your board a little better, or rather you get to damage their board while developing your own hand. So card advantage-wise, it has similar advantage to Subvert, which I would say is actually a pretty good card, but it is a little bit more impactful on the board, and you can do some pretty cool things with it, like steal Xenon Obelisk, or steal your opponent's Azindil's Gift. You can steal like any number of interesting things off of your opponent's board and take them and maybe get some use out of them yourself. If you don't want to play them, that's fine, but typically most relics are going to be pretty useful on your end, similar to being useful on your opponent's end. Like things like Xenon Obelisk, or even like the effects that summon on the 3 damage one, like Ancient Defenses, Paladin Notebook, like Azindil's Gift. There are lots of relics that you can steal, and most relics are going to be good when you play them. There are a couple that you're not going to be too happy to get, like Combustion Cell, or the like the Sacrifice relics. There are some relics that are just not going to be quite as good, and overall I would say that does like decrease the flexibility of the card a little bit. Most people do have relics, but having an entire spell to deal with relics is a little bit tricky, and it means that you might not really want to play Burglarize in a ranked deck format. That being said, it is pretty powerful. It steals opponents' relics. It gets rid of like Auric Runehammers and cool relic weapons. It does a lot of cool things on that front, and like the overall card advantage on it is solid. I'd say this card makes more sense as a sideboard card against relics. Shadow doesn't have that much relic hate, especially when the relics are currently on the ground, so this gives Shadow some ability to deal with like the armory sets and a couple of other interesting setups, and you can maybe get some really interesting benefit out of that. Because the card is actually fairly powerful, you might see it played in ranked. It really depends on how many relics are actually getting played, but I would say that overall this card is not terribly likely to see a lot of play on that front. That being said, I like this effect. I actually like sort of the slow spell steal at this cost. Like, it's nice to have a bunch of steal cards, and this is a really fun one. The Nightfall ability is interesting because normally what you're doing with steal cards is you're dismantling your opponent's stuff and giving you a big like hand advantage. But Burglarize actually gives your opponent 2 cards to replace the one that they lost, which means that they're very likely to just continue to build their board out. And that can be really tricky if you're trying to get into a situation where you are actually in the major advantage. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, but obviously, yeah, it is something that works very well as a sideboard card, which means it works very well as a market card. Since market is our current sideboard setup, you can just sort of put it in there and then grab it out of with your shadow marketer, the 2/1 deadly for 3, and then just pick it up whenever you need a relic. So that'll be pretty cool stuff. If you want to do that, that's a pretty good way to use the card, and I think that's probably where the card is solidly going to belong, in the market, but not in the main board. I wouldn't say that it's a very good draft card just because it's really hard to get relics in draft, but, you know, it really depends on whether or not there are a ton of good relics. I'm guessing probably not so much. Okay, let's see here. Let's go for the splashy legendary next. So splashy. So I'm sure that you've heard the Combray Alliance is unbreakable, but today's Unbreakable Alliance is, funnily enough, a Skycrag card. I find that just hilarious that Champion of Progress is the big Unbreakable Alliance guy, but when it finally comes to the Unbreakable Alliance, what we are seeing is, in fact, Eileen and a bunch of Skycrag on the Eternal Throne. So we're seeing here the continuation of the Fall of Argenport's story, which is that Eileen has taken the throne, and appears to be holding it pretty well. Daraka Queensguard is in that picture as well. You got plenty of Skycrag folks just hanging around. This card is an 8 cost with double green influence that gains 12 armor as a slow spell. That's a lot to unpack, but it's not necessarily like the greatest. It is still actually pretty fun. So this is a big ol' life gain card, and if you're using it as just a big ol' life gain card, it's absolutely the worst. Like, you never want to spend 8 to gain 12. Like, spending 3 to gain, like, 8 is fairly questionable, or 5 to gain 8. I can't remember what Last Light is. I think it's 5 to gain 8. Spending 2 to gain 6 isn't really all that great. Spending 8 to gain 12 is just, like, absolutely just obnoxious. But what you do want to do with this card is basically use it in a deck where you are running just a pile of Sword of the Sky Kings, right? Like, if you have 4 Sword of the Sky Kings and then like 2 Unbreakable Alliances, then the Unbreakable Alliance is going to be a better card than your next Sword of the Sky King. It's also pretty good with Molten Fist, obviously. Like, if you can just give yourselves a ton of armor, then you can make yourself a really, really big Molten Fist and do some pretty cool, fun stuff with that. If you want to, like, make this so you can get your Plated Demolisher deck off the ground, like, we actually have some green-red Plated Demolisher shenanigans armor decks that can probably play Unbreakable Alliance. This card fits a very, very specific niche. It's really easy to build around, so if you get it picked up, like, you know what cards are going to go in it. It's going to be Molten Fist, it's going to be Sword of the Sky King, it's going to be a bunch of armory weapons that are actually pretty highly costed, and then it's going to be ways to ramp up to those weapons so that you can get control of the board and just completely rock it. And that'll be a functional strategy. I'd say this deck is going to be like, you know, a ranked tier 3. Nothing crazy, but certainly a lot of fun to play and something that you could actually potentially even grind to master with if you really, really wanted to. So, yeah, it's a fun card. It's fun to play. I have no objections to that, and it's a cool legendary to pick up. Beyond that, like, you know, it's definitely not powerful. It's not going to be tier 1 anytime soon, but, you know, maybe if some particular armory strategy gets very obnoxious, you could see it in there in the sideboard or even in the main board. Someone's mentioning Last Stand at the Gate. Sure, extra armor and Last Stand at the Gate gives you something. Like, it is all of the extra life you need to regain yourself back to a position of strength after Last Standing at the Gate, assuming you don't die the turn that you play it. So, yeah, there are all sorts of shenanigans that you can do with this card, and it's certainly a worthy card to have in a small set. It's definitely not the legendary you want to pull first, but I still think it's a lot of fun to play, so I'm happy to see it in here. Okay, this one is my favorite of the ones that were spoiled this weekend. Rika, Desert Navigator. A 1/5 for 3 that whenever it hits the enemy player, the top card of your deck gets Warp this turn. Now, we've seen some Warp cards coming into green and blue. There's a Warp counterspell happening now, and I'm really glad to just see Warp coming back as sort of an evergreen or just potentially, like, reusable mechanic that we might see in many different sets. So, like, that's really cool. Like, this is a mechanic that can be used really well and does a lot of cool things, and Rika Desert Navigator is actually, like, a really, really good take on that card. So it's a 3-cost 1/5 in monocolor. and that is actually not a bad stat line. That's an Auric Sentry stat line, so if you've ever faced down an Auric Sentry, you'll know that they're extremely annoyingly hard to kill. Like, you are just going to have a hard time getting rid of this the turn that it comes out. It's actually pretty likely to stick on the board and be able to kill your opponent's stuff, which is basically what you want out of it. If it doesn't stick on the board, it still probably at least eats something that would have been intended for a larger target, so Rika is usually not going to be like, oh, I played Rika and my opponent killed it with like a 1-cost spell, I'm sad now. That doesn't happen too much unless you get suffocated or permafrosted. And, you know, that's not great, but you're in the same setup where you can actually run Boar and lots of attachment destruction, and I don't know about Suffocate, like maybe you'll be able to get some sort of answer to that, but all the same, I think that Rika is probably like in a pretty good spot as far as getting played and being able to activate its ability. Now, Rika does not necessarily do a lot on board by herself. Like, the ability to deal damage to your opponent is very, very limited. It doesn't trade well with other units. You need ways to get this card across. There are plenty of ways to do that in red, and plenty of ways that you're going to want to be exploring, like if you want to do Cinder Yetis or any sort of exhaust mechanics. That's actually pretty reasonable, and you can potentially get a decent amount of benefit out of that. So, like, certainly there are lots of ways to get Rika across for damage. Maybe you could do like Skycrag Icebow stuff, or you could do this in like Praxis with a bunch of exhausting abilities. So there's a little bit going on there. And then because she gives the top card of your deck Warp, then you start to get card advantage out of her every time that she hits. Now, this is still tricky because you're not necessarily going to be able to cast the thing that gets Warp, but if you're playing a decent amount of aggression, or if you're playing like a decent amount of just like 4 drops to 5 drops, you're pretty likely to be able to play whatever it is that you want to play off of Rika. The other thing that you can do with Rika is you can give cards Warp that would not otherwise be able to get Warp, which allows you to do things like play Workshop Forge-based strategies where you discount all of your Warp cards, you play a bunch of Warp cards in general, you warp out all of those cards, and then when you finally get to something that can't be warped, you Rika Desert Navigator it and make it a Warp card yourself. So there are some cool ways that you can like even get some cards with Warp on top of your deck and do cool things with that. I actually really like this card with Workshop Forge in particular, just because the discount means that whatever it is that you're playing with Rika is pretty likely to be very playable later on in the game. Yeah, this card looks like a fun top deck. Like, in an empty board, she absolutely devastates. She gives you a ton of card advantage and basically just has the kind of tempo that you really, really want in a red deck. So, like, I would say that, like, that ability to give you card advantage in red is really, really powerful. And the fact that she's a survivable 1/5, like, is able to actually do some cool things. Like, this enables some really cool strategies for red decks that want to go big and want to go late. So that's really cool. I love cards like these in red, and I'm always interested in seeing more of them. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about Rika. She seems like a really, really fun card. In draft, she's absolutely bonkers. Like, she's really hard to deal with, and the warp ability is very annoying. It's a little easier to block her in draft, but you've got lots of ways to exhaust opposing units in draft. So I would say that she's actually a really cool bomb rare if you want to run her. Could be really a lot of fun. Okay, so that's the ones from this weekend, with the exception of Savage Denial, a 1-cost fast spell that negates an enemy fast spell. This is a particular type of design that I'm not terribly fond of, but it's not because it's a bad card or anything like that. It is actually a pretty good card, and it deals with a lot of necessary answers and threats very quickly. Because Savage Denial is very, very cheap, it means that you can use it in lots of aggressive blue decks. You can play just tons of like scary units, and then as long as you're attacking, you can pretty easily negate some very, very nasty spells like Feeding Time or Death Strike or In Cold Blood, or really, not Feeding Time or In Cold Blood, but like anything that like responds to your opponent's stuff when you're attacking can be really, really good. If you Savage Denial a Finest Hour, you can kill a unit. You can get like a 2-for-1. Like, you can get some really, really good benefits in general from just using Savage Denial to knock particular fast spells out of the whole set. And like, yeah, that kind of like answer to like Feln stuff is pretty necessary if you want to do like blue aggro. This could be very good in the whole Huru, I don't want you to play the right kinds of spells type deck. And yeah, might be well worth playing in like your weird Daring Pioneer, fairly aggressive, ridiculous deck. It doesn't prevent Daring Pioneer from going off and countering other cards, but it does mean that you can actually deal with like basically anything that isn't Hailstorm or Harsh Roll, and that can be really, really effective in the right setup. So yeah, This card is very spiky. I would say it's actually very good for that reason, but it really does depend on what type of deck you're building. It's disruptive, it's obnoxious, it's very cheap. So certainly worth picking up. And it's also a 1-drop, which is going to matter for one other card that we're going to be looking at later on in this exact setup. So yeah, that's the basics on Savage Denial. This card is spiky and fun. I don't know that you'd want it in draft, but I think in ranked it is definitely going to be a front runner in some decks that want to be very aggressive, and potentially even in some control decks that just don't want to get like channeled out, you know, or whatever else happens. Is Channel the Tempest a slow spell? I think it's a fast spell. No, it's a slow spell. I'm just thinking of Temporal Distortion. All right. Okay. So, now, that leaves us with the new mechanic, Berserk. So let's go ahead and talk about Berserk. And we're going to lead with Territorial Elf as we talk about Berserk. Berserk is the new mechanic. We have finally established what it is. There's a 5-cost card in blue that we have already talked about a little bit that gives Berserk to every unit. And that's important to note. So what Berserk is, it is a conditional on-attack ability that when you attack, you get to choose whether or not the unit goes Berserk. If it goes Berserk, then immediately after attacking, it gets another attack and gains Reckless instead of Berserk. So, for example, if you have a Territorial Elf and you attack for 3, and you decide that you want to go Berserk with your Territorial Elf, then you can immediately attack again after your Territorial Elf does the first amount of damage. If it dies, then it dies. It doesn't get to attack again. But the second attack is allowed as a Reckless unit, and you can get a full 6 damage in with it, like, immediately after you have hit everything on. So that's the basic idea behind Berserk, and I think that's all of the major rules. It goes Reckless, becomes mad. It has to survive its first attack, but you get to choose when it goes Berserk. You don't have to go Berserk every time that you attack. So pretty important stuff because it gives you a lot of choices and a lot of sort of tactical value to whether or not you actually want to make Reckless happen. I would say most of the time you're going to want to go Berserk as soon as you're able to attack and not be blocked. But it's something to note, like if you are going to attack into an obvious block, you don't go Berserk because you can later on resurrect that card and it'll still have Berserk, and you can get your double attack that way. So there are some options there. Okay, so our first example of Territorial Elf, our first example of a Berserk card is Territorial Elf, which is a 3/1 that can't block that has Berserk. This is a pretty bananas like draft tempo card because it is really capable of just dealing a tremendous amount of damage in a very, very short period of time. If you want to get an idea of how ridiculous this card can be in situations where your opponent is choosing not to deal with it, or where your opponent's curve is bad or anything along those lines, like the ideal curve for Territorial Elf is something like Minotaur Oathkeeper, the 1/1 that gives a +1/+1 to attackers, Territorial Elf on 2, and then 3 Finest Hours on 3 for lethal, or Finest Hour Rapid Shot for 22 damage. Like, you can do absolutely ridiculous things with that double attack because it effectively gives it double damage the turn that it swings in. So you can definitely get some pretty crazy combos off with the card, and it certainly has some good synergies with cards that I believe are mentioned in the article, like Rapid Shot and Stone Scar Sneak. Anything that gives it like a little bit of extra oomph over the like 3 damage that it's dealing is pretty crazy. Victor's Cry, Rampage, any type of Overwhelm, Caleb's Intervention even doesn't actually seem like such a bad deal. Like, you can certainly give this a lot of ways to deal just a ton of damage in a very, very short period of time. To that extent, I think this card sees a little bit of play in ranked, most likely in some sort of Stone Scar or Argenport list, where you are trying to just out-aggro your opponent very, very quickly. You play down a very aggressive 2-drop with no blocking capabilities, you wipe out your opponent's stuff, and then you beef up Territorial Elf at the turn that you most expect Territorial Elf to deal a ridiculous amount of damage. You do that with Finest Hour or Rapid Shot or Pummel or any number of other interesting tricks, and once that happens, you actually have just an insanely aggressive card, and then you can finish out with Burn or some sort of reach ability to just make a really nice aggressive deck happen. So Territorial Elf probably sees play in Ranked. Like, this card doesn't have a lot of flexibility. It's only designed for a very specific task, but it's another 2-drop in the frame of Argenport Instigator or other cards that can actually do like a ridiculous amount of just nasty, nasty things. Now, the main problem with this card, of course, is that it has 1 health. It is very vulnerable to Vara's favor. There are a lot of things that kill 1 health units in Ranked, and that is going to put a fairly limiting amount of general... Like, it's going to limit that power quite a bit. I would say this card is not going to be absolutely amazing by any right. Like, there are a lot of cards with 1 health that just don't make the list as 2-drops, even if they have ridiculous abilities. That being said, you can definitely play this in aggro. Like, you can play cards like Bladekin Apprentice in aggro decks and do really well with them. Territorial Elf is actually significantly better than that in terms of what kind of aggro it can generate. So, yeah, this is on par. This is actually probably going to be a decently high tier card. In Draft, this card has the same limitations, and the limitations are a little bit worse, but the aggressive part of it is even better. Like, if you can actually build the draft around this card, you will just win your drafts very, very quickly, and that's going to be very, very hard for your opponent to deal with. You do need, however, a lot of small removal and also some good pump spells. If you can get both of those things, then Territorial Elf will just steal games, and it'll be great. If you can't get those things, then Territorial Elf will be a fairly mediocre pick. I would say it's still going to be pretty solid in Draft, and the fact that Vara's Favor is not in Draft means that this card does not die as quick as most other things. That being said, there's also Amethyst Acolyte, other things that often don't get played that will kill Territorial Elf and create more problems for you than you'd rather they have. So, overall, not too bad. Also, it's an elf, which there aren't that many elves right now, and there's a couple of elven tribal cards, or at least there's one, and there may be more, so good to note, and maybe we'll see a couple more of those in the upcoming set. I'm pretty excited about that idea. Alright, there were 3 Berserk cards spoiled. Let's look at the flip side, which is Rusty Grenamotive. A 1/4 Berserk that whenever it attacks, you get +1 power this turn. Okay, so this one can go Berserk pretty easy. You don't need to go Berserk, remember, if you attack. Like, you can just always get the 1 power off of Grenamotive by attacking with it. And I would say that that is, you know, a reasonable benefit. Like, this card is a 3-cost 1/4 that's pretty likely to give you 1 power every turn. It means that you'll have to be playing fairly aggressively. You'll have to be doing like some amount of like actually making sure that your opponent doesn't block it, or, you know, doesn't have like a Sandstorm Titan down. That's hard for red to do, and that might really limit this card's ability in Ranked. But the ability to ramp up twice very, very quickly, combined with the fact that it can be basically use, like, you can do some spark triggers with Kindle, you can do Combustion Cell, you can actually get like 7 or 8 drops out with Rusty Grenamotive very, very fast. And it's yet another card on that sort of fast ramp ability of red, which is reason to distrust it, just because none of those fast ramp cards in red have actually seen any tier 1 play. But I would say that it's one of the stronger ones on the list, and because it also has the ability to get beefed up by weapons and do other cool things, like, this card actually has some potential as a ranked card. I'm not saying it's going to be in a tier 1 deck. I think that's fairly unlikely, but it's interesting. It definitely has the stats to get across for that 1 power. I think at the very least it is a functional card that's going to get you exactly what you want out of it, which is the extra power to play 5 drops or 6 drops. Getting the double attack on it, it's going to be a lot of fun. You won't always get it, but it's going to be usually kind of worth it when you do. So, something worth considering. I'd say that Grenamotive has a decent amount of power there. In Draft, this card is probably actually pretty bonkers. It's a 1/4, so the stat line's good enough that you're probably going to get the Berserk ability. You don't really even care if it goes Reckless if you're using it to just beef out a 5-drop on the turn that you play it. Like, Rusty Grenamotive, then attack, then play a 5-drop is really, really solid, and you're fairly likely to do that in Draft, I think. It's pretty likely that Grenamotive lives long enough to get you the sort of aggression that you want to play the cards that you need. So, yeah, I'd say this card actually might have some potential in Draft, assuming that you're playing sort of a deep curve, high-end red deck that actually does some really, really cool things with it. It pairs pretty well with Rika, actually. If you want to do like a Yeti flip-type deck or a red-yellow accelerated evolution deck, then you could do some really, really cool things with the 1/4s and 1/5s that that are attacking for just bananas amounts of damage and also giving you ramp and also allowing you to warp cards, like, that's a pretty fun shenanigans deck that we'll probably be building. And I think that, yeah, Greta Motive definitely has some potential for interesting shenanigans. I don't think it's a high power card, but it's got potential. All right, last one. The last one is actually pretty exciting, and this one might be more powerful than even Territorial Elf. It is Acquisitive Crow. So this is a 2/1 flying Berserk that when it attacks, creates and draws a random 1-cost spell. Okay, that's a little bit to unpack, right? So first off, this card is in the middle between the two on survivability. It's very likely to get its Berserk ability when you want to. You can also just attack with it constantly to create free 1-cost spells, which is a good way to get card advantage, a good way to get some fairly exciting things out of your setup. As we mentioned, like, you can get that Savage Denial card off of Acquisitive Crow. You can get a wild amount of other things that are pretty interesting. If Acquisitive Crow doesn't die the turn that it's played, this card can potentially just be very, very, very hard to deal with. Like, if your opponent is trying to kill it with a spell, you might end up with a Savage Denial. If your opponent is trying to block it with a unit, then you might have a Finest Hour, or a Pummel, or a Caleb's Intervention, although that's not going to help you all that much because it's not a fast spell. You can get fast or slow spells. There are a lot of interesting things that you can grab. Levitate, at the very least, cantrips you into basically anything that you want, and it's just a free card. Pummel is really, really solid for the scout and the ability to keep the crow alive to attack again. Finest Hour is insanely strong because it means that the crow does 10 damage on the turn that it's played, or on the turn that it's attacking. That's pretty crazy stuff. You can do any sort of thing like slow or silence. I don't know if you can get chill. Chill is I don't think you can get that out of a random pool. That's an AI card, but you can get other things like silence or slow or Water of Life. If you draw Water of Life, you will get the Echo trigger off of it, and so you'll have an extra 6 life, which is not that bad off of Acquisitive Crow. Yeah, there is a reasonable amount of good 1-cost spells, and there are a lot of things you can actually do with it. This enables some cool Caldera Cradle decks where you want to just play a bunch of spells. If you want to do Moment of Creation things, you can do lots of things with Acquisitive Crow that can really sort of help you out. But overall, the card on its own, you don't have to actually lean into this too hard. This is a 2/1 flyer that generally can win the game if it's left unattended, because eventually it will pick up a Finest Hour or something else that will just cause it to deal 10 damage to your opponent. And the double attack is quite ridiculous. It's just a constant card advantage engine that is consistently attacking. The stat line is really not that bad for a card that's drawing a card every turn. Yeah, this card actually sees play in Ranked, I think, and it's probably going to be pretty reasonable. It's easier to kill than most, and it is fairly easy to kill a lot of cards along those lines, but in the sort of blue control deck that you want to do, this is your Thieving Magpie type situation. This is a card that can actually do a ridiculous amount if you are actually getting to actively attack with it. So you'll find ways to actively attack with it, or at least you'll be able to play it, and it'll be a threat that your opponent absolutely has to respond to, or it will just take the game away. I think that's really on the strong side as far as things go. It doesn't get to double attack every turn, so keep that in mind. You can only choose to go Berserk once, and you may choose to go Berserk the turn that you attack with it, because that seems like a pretty reasonable thing if you want to just make sure that you're doing everything. But you could also try to play the long game, try and get that Finest Hour and that extra 10 damage or something like that, and play just very, very slow and greedy. And I think that there's a decent amount of stuff going on with that as well. So yeah, this card is real strong. I think that it has good potential in Ranked. The vulnerability of it is an issue, and certainly there are lots of ways that this card can die, but overall the fact that your opponent pretty much has to respond to a 3-drop is pretty good for you, and you can definitely do a lot of things with this card if it is allowed to continue to stay on the board. So yeah, this is the card that you run Savage Denials in your deck for. The kind of weird shenanigans with Disruption where you are just constantly interfering with your opponent's plans and cranking out card advantage over and over and over again, I'd say that's going to be pretty reasonable. Obviously, this card is a draft bomb. It is a 2-1 that just like is utterly ridiculous. A 2-1 for 3 is not even all that bad if it's a flyer in draft, and then the ability to just constantly draw extra cards that can really benefit you, and especially to draw cards that will answer your opponent's answers, is very, very good, and I would say that there is a lot of good stuff going on there. It doesn't die to Vara's favor in draft because there is no Vara's favor in draft, so the one card that's most likely to take it out isn't there. This card is just going to be absolutely bananas if you pick it up in draft, and I highly recommend that you first pick it unless there is something utterly insane or some cool legendary that you really, really want. Alright, that should be it for the spoilers for tonight. It was a pretty crazy ride. Like, I'd say that overall, like, Fall of Argenport is shaping up to be full of really powerful cards. It does not appear to be like the Omens small set. Like, we are seeing a lot of stuff here that actually is going to see plenty of play, going to define some cool deck archetypes, going to do some really interesting things. We're also going to see, like, some really, really interesting new types of decks. Like, I can definitely see some blue disruptive aggro decks coming around, some card advantage crankers, like some really fun stuff in that front that we've never really seen before. Should be really fun, strong primal stuff happening. Like, I don't know what else you're going to look like, but I'm kind of interested in it. There's going to be some weird Berserk aggro, like very, very aggressive and fun. That should be like a wild, wild time. So yeah, like it's looking like Fall of Argenport is going to be a lot of fun, and I'm pretty excited for what's to come. So hopefully I will be around for that. If not, we will be releasing some Eternal videos, hopefully Eternal Basics videos over the week. But regardless, I'm real excited. So that's it for me. So thank you guys so much for watching. To the YouTube folks, thank you for watching, and feel free to like or subscribe and all of that jazz. To Twitch folks, we're gonna go back to playing some Eternal. So see you in just a moment.